Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Megan Arnett, the Executive Director of the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry, and it's wonderful to have you all joining our conversation today. Many of you may already be aware of the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry, or BCGC, and our work on campus. And for those of you who are not, I'm going to take this opportunity to spend a few minutes just talking about our center and our impact. BCGC is celebrating its 12th birthday this year, which marks over a decade of education, research, and community collaboration, all directed towards the design and use of safer chemicals and materials. The mission of our center is to embed the principles of green chemistry into interdisciplinary sciences, markets, and public policy in order to advance the industry movement toward the design and use of safer chemicals and materials. In this way, we work towards safeguarding human health and ecosystems and provide a cornerstone for a sustainable, clean energy economy. Our center takes an interdisciplinary approach to the problem of harmful chemicals and products and processes, bringing together the College of Chemistry, the School of Public Health, the Haas School of Business, and the College of Engineering in order to develop, identify, and promote sustainable alternatives that are better for humans and for our environment. We go about this in several ways: through research, industry engagement, and education, including administering the Greener Solutions course, which is a unique project-based course that partners interdisciplinary student teams with industry partners who are looking for an alternative to a harmful chemical in their product or their process. This course has brought about exciting product reformulations and driven research in a broad range of industry sectors, from antimicrobials and household cleaning products to 6-PPD in tires. And it continues to be a resource to both industry partners looking to make positive change in their products, as well as to students who are interested in applying their Berkeley education to the spectrum of problems posed by hazardous chemicals. The students that graduate from this and other programs within the College of Chemistry go on to do truly impactful work in the fields of green chemistry and engineering, as evidenced by the panel you'll be hearing from today. And on that note, I'm delighted to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Martin Mulhivill. Marty graduated with a PhD from the College of Chemistry in 2009. During his time as a graduate student, Marty's research focused on developing technologies that help provide access to clean drinking water and the creation of safer chemicals and materials based on biological feedstocks. This work reinforced Marty's commitment to the field of green and sustainable chemistry, and immediately after graduating, he founded the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry and directed it for 5 years, creating a permanent space for this work and ideology on campus. After establishing the center, Marty continued developing new ventures. In 2016, he founded SaferMade, where he continues to serve as a managing partner. SaferMade is a mission-driven venture capital fund that invests in companies and technologies that reduce human exposure to harmful chemicals. In this role, Marty has worked with many Fortune 500 companies across a broad spectrum of industries, from personal care to construction and lots in between, all with the outcome of helping these organizations replace hazardous chemicals with safer alternatives. Marty has been a thought leader, a trailblazer, and perhaps most importantly, an undeterred optimist in the field of green and sustainable chemistry. And for all of these reasons, it is now my pleasure to hand the floor over to him. Thank you, Marty.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan, and happy Earth Day to everyone. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm excited to be back at Berkeley today to celebrate Earth Day and to discuss the future of green and sustainable chemistry with a few of the discipline's rising stars, all of whom, of course, are graduates of UC Berkeley, many of whom also have connections to the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry. But before we dive into the groundbreaking research that's being done by each of our panelists, I'd like to provide a little bit of context for today's discussion. Climate change is widely recognized as one of the most significant environmental challenges of our time. And as chemists, our challenge is to design and produce the next generation of chemicals, plastics, and materials that reduce CO2 impact while also maximizing human health and ecosystem resilience. This is crucial for all types of chemistry, everything from surfactants to solar cells. Because according to the OECD, the chemical industry consumes more energy than iron, steel, or cement industries. In fact, it's the world's largest industrial energy consumer, consuming about 18% of global CO2 emissions, or emitting about 18% of global CO2. While this may be the most direct impact that the industry has on climate change, there are two other connections that are important to consider for today's talks. And because not only the production of chemicals create CO2, but changes to our global climate also change how chemicals impact ecosystems. So, it's important to recognize that hazardous chemical releases do often occur after climatic related events, including recent floods, hurricanes, and fires. In fact, an EPA report released earlier this year estimates that nearly 1/3, or over 3,000 of the hazardous chemical facilities in the United States are located in areas that are at risk from climate-driven storms, wildfires, and floods. And it's important to remember that these chemical exposures impact habitat loss and ecosystem resilience by adding chemical, physical, and genetic stressors to organisms that are already under pressure from a changing planet and a changing climate. And while organisms may be able to respond over time to one or two stressors, the combination creates a negative feedback loop and decreases ecosystem resilience. The good news is chemists are already working on safer chemistry to address these challenges. Everything from shifting to renewable feedstocks, to developing safer input chemistries, to new technologies that will help remove some of these pollutants from the environment. And I think you're going to be optimistic too after hearing today's speakers discuss their research, because they're all working on problems related to these three intersections between climate change and chemistry. So our first speaker will be Heather Buckley, who's an assistant professor of civil engineering and an associate director for the Center of Advanced Materials and Related Technologies. Heather did her PhD with John Arnold and postdoc at the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry. Then we'll be hearing from Billy Hart-Cooper, who's currently a research chemist at the USDA and is also a lecturer in the Greener Solutions program that Megan mentioned earlier. He also did his PhD at Berkeley. And finally, we'll be hearing from LoongYi Tan, who's the director of product at Solugen, a rapidly growing next generation chemical company producing a wide range of chemicals from biomass. In addition to doing his undergraduate degree in chemical engineering at UC Berkeley, LoongYi is also a fellow product of the Central Valley, where we know a thing or two about biomass. So, after each panelist has a chance to introduce themselves and their work, I'm going to have follow-up questions for each of them, and then we'll be turning to questions from the audience. So please be thinking about questions that you have for each of our speakers and use the question and answer tab rather than chat tab down below to share questions that you'd like our panelists to respond to. With that, let's get started. I would like each of our panelists to take a few minutes to introduce your research and how it addresses current challenges in sustainability and green chemistry. Heather, I'd like to turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Marty. And thanks everyone for joining us here today on Earth Day. I'm excited to be here with all of these great folks, a lot of whom I've had the chance to work with before. As Marty said, I'm at the University of Victoria in beautiful British Columbia, Canada, where I'm a member of a group that is aiming to be the greenest civil engineering department in Canada. It's been pretty amazing the last few years being in this space where taking the chemistry background and training I have and applying that in a space where we're really focused around water, which is a huge and pressing issue around climate change and sustainability, because water availability is changing throughout the world, and many places are finding themselves under a steady state of crisis of either water quality or water quantity. So in my research group, we apply green chemistry solutions to addressing challenges around reverse osmosis desalination, using safer chemistries to prevent biofouling in those. We work on pathogenicity prevention by designing surfaces that can have that can prevent microbe growth through the shining visible light on them. With some of that, we're using chemistry that is much like what we developed in the Arnold group during my PhD, porphyrinoids that I said I would never touch again. And yet here we are, and they're doing wonderful and amazing things. And a lot of this work really builds on things that have come out of Greener Solutions and collaborations, including ongoing work with Billy and his team and with folks at Method Home.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview, Heather. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about today. But before we do that, let's turn it over to Billy.
Everyone, Billy Hart-Cooper. I work at the USDA in the Agricultural Research Service. So as we call it, ARS is the research arm of the USDA. And we're made of about 2,000 scientists scattered across the country, scientists like me. And there's 4 major research areas, and one of them is just down the street from UC Berkeley. So I've been working there since I got my PhD in 2015, and it's a really fun place to work on. Our main mission is to increase the value of agricultural products, support the agricultural sector and the bioeconomy, and work closely with stakeholders to develop solutions for them. Some of the main areas that my group is focused on, the bioproducts group, is to make bio-based chemicals and materials that are less hazardous to humans and the environment. So certain specific areas would be biodegradable packaging, reversible actives, so antimicrobials and pesticides that fall apart when you're done using them to reduce ecological toxicity and aquatic toxicity and the development of antibiotic resistance. But the big picture is that we work very closely with stakeholders that come to us with a problem, and their problems have a big influence on what we're working on and what our solutions are. So we work very closely with companies, farmers, really anyone that wants to develop something sustainable in a way that aligns with our 5-year plan.
Thank you, Billy. Now let's turn it over to LoongYi. Tell us a little bit about Solugen.
Yep. Hey, so this is LoongYi here at Solugen. So as Marty said, my role here is Director of Product. So Solugen is a Houston-based post-Series C venture capital-backed startup. And what we do is we make bio-based chemicals from sugars using enzymes. So my role here is I work with our R&D team and our sales and business development team, and specifically trying to see how we can take new molecules like glucaric acid into new applications like water treatment. So similar to Heather, I spend a lot of my time working in the water treatment space where companies and customers are looking for bio-based molecules that have a much better ESG or environmental footprint. So currently a lot of people use chemicals that are made of phosphorus that cause algae blooms, and Solugen has found that our glucaric-based molecules can have equal or better performance without the environmental algae blooms. And so that's what I work with our sales team, our business development team, our R&D team, connecting those pieces together so we can bring new technology to market.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. And now I'm going to stick with LoongYi just for a couple follow-up questions about what it took to develop this green chemistry to a scale where you're actually able to produce and sell it. So maybe give us a little bit of a feeling for what that facility looks like there in Texas, and what was the journey to get from an idea to where you're at today?
Sure. I mean, it's a lot of work. So Solugen is a close to 150-person company, and we were founded in 2016. So currently we make our bio-based molecules at a 5-acre facility near Sugar Land. And basically we have about four main unit operations that allows us to take liquid corn sugar from the Midwest using enzymes and metal catalysts, and that allows us to make molecules like glucaric acid for water treatment. On site, we have scientists and engineers, enzyme scientists from CAMTEC and renowned universities around the country. We also have an on-site pilot plant where we have our enzyme reactor, not just a small one, but we have like one that's about 15 foot tall. And then we can walk just a couple steps outside into our production facility in Houston, and we have about a 40-foot tall enzyme reactor that allows us to make about 10,000 metric tons of these chemistries on an annual basis. So it's a good sized plant, but I think to make a big impact in for sustainable chemicals, we really need to scale up. And 10,000 metric tons is a good start, but it's not where we need to be.
Excellent. And tell us a little bit about the folks that are using glucaric acid to clean up water. You mentioned that it'll avoid algae blooms, but what were they using before that might have been leading to algae blooms or other things? So what is being replaced in this case?
Yeah. So at Solugen, within the water treatment space, we're very focused on the cooling tower segment. So think of cooling towers that are used anywhere from hospital buildings for AC units, all the way to large refineries where they have cooling towers to cool down process streams, in their chemical plants. And so in those cooling towers, basically a lot of people use phosphorus-based chemistries, specifically things like HEDP or PBTC, as a corrosion and scale control. Because basically what a cooling tower is, you take water, you evaporate it, and then as you evaporate, the water cools down. But the problem is that when you evaporate the water, you're actually building up hardness, or you're building up these calcium, iron, manganese ions that cause or accelerate corrosion and scale throughout your piping, your heat exchangers. So currently they use these phosphorus-based chemistries to sort of help manage that, right? They are effective, but we're at a point where certain regions in the US, like specifically around Lake Erie, they're actually dealing with like large harmful algal blooms, where parts like Lake Erie, 50% of Lake Erie could be, covered by algae, sometime during the summer, right? And so a lot of communities are working on, how can we help manage that? And where Solugen is trying to help that problem is, we're trying to say, instead of trying to kill the algae out in the lake, is there a way that we can use a bio-based chemistry to actually try to see if we can develop some data to prove that it is more efficacious and better than HEDP, plus it has all these ancillary benefits. So I spend a lot of time on what is our technical data that we have from our team? How do I build a value proposition around it? And then how do I take that data and convince different people in the value chain or the stakeholders on like what's important to them, right? The communities might care about the algae piece. For the owner of the cooling tower, they might be caring about corrosion, right? So we're taking that technical data and we transform it to something that everybody can understand. So that's what I do.
Excellent. That's really helpful. It really is a great demonstration of the idea of moving upstream to avoid having to deal with problems downstream, having to avoid using antimicrobial chemistry in the actual algae blooms by just avoiding their creation in the first place. And on that note, I'd like to shift to Heather, since you are also an expert in water treatment. Now that we heard a little bit about where Solugen and glucaric acid play in this system, can you dive a little deeper into your research and share where the chemistry you're working on, where these porphyrinoids and other chemistries fit into the water treatment process? What underlying challenge are you addressing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have that complementarity of work with what we're doing, LoongYi. So the big thing that we're looking at doing is very much related to the prevention of scaling in so many contexts. Biofouling, so microbial growth on surfaces that's unwanted, co-occurs with scaling, which is chemical or mineral growth on surfaces, because the roughness of each of those provides environments that are ready places for the other to attach. And so you often actually end up with a mixture of the two of them together. So the types of solutions we work on are very complementary in that way. So the coolest work we've got going on right now, among a lot of really neat pieces, is this light activated antimicrobial material, where we're taking porphyrinoids, so molecules that look a lot like what you see in hemoglobin, and if you shine visible light on them, then you get interaction with oxygen, which you'd expect from hemoglobin. And specifically what we see in this case is that singlet oxygen is generated in a pretty high yield, and singlet oxygen will kill any microbes that are within a couple micron path of it. It has quite a short path length, though. That travel of only a couple microns means that using these in environments that could include wearables or could include materials that people are touching to their skin, materials that people are drinking out of, doesn't pose any hazard to humans. And as soon as you turn off the light, the antimicrobial goes away within a couple of microseconds there. So you're not dealing with any residual toxicity or potential unwanted harm in the system. Now, what really makes these materials unique is, rather than coating them on or blending them into a plastic or another material where they would be able to leach out into the environment and run into potential issues downstream, is we're covalently tethering them using a diazurine cross-linking technology. So a cross-linker that basically goes onto anything, onto your simple hydrocarbons, which is a pretty exciting way of making sure that not only does this chemistry go where we want it to do and do what we want it to do, but it stays put there. And so we don't have to think as much about what the end of life is going to be, because we know exactly where its end of life is going to take place. And so we can manage that appropriately.
That's exciting. And it's really interesting to see how that you've already thought about not only the function, taking care of the microbial growth, but also the context. So what's going to happen to this after it's done? One of the things that I would be curious to hear just a little bit more about is what is the source, what's the feedstock for these chemistries? We heard from LoongYi that they're working with biomass. I'm curious how you think about feedstock in this case.
Yeah, so feedstock's definitely one of our challenges here, and where as we're scaling up, it's one of the things that isn't a totally solved problem in our case, but the simpler, as we're making simpler porphyrins, we're able to make them from more readily available materials. But we don't have as good a solution to feedstocks. I'll be honest on this one. In a lot of cases, we are doing chemistry where I guess the context of what we're moving away from and moving to can matter a lot, in that we're moving away from many anti-fouling surfaces being copper-based, which has problems in terms of its feedstocks in and of itself, and has problems in terms of leaching. So often we're being able to do otherwise very similar chemistry, but minus the copper. But at this point, we are still looking at hydrocarbon feedstocks. And so we're super open and excited, and related work in our group that admittedly doesn't feed this directly does have to do with developing bioplastics from kelp-based alginates. But at this point, we don't have a pipeline from our kelp-based alginates into our antimicrobial materials. And that is a real challenge that I think exists across the spectrum of chemistry, of getting highly functional materials that perform interesting and complex operations, and in this case, performing them selectively in a way that damages microbes and not humans, and also trying to find a feedstock that is an inherently sustainable feedstock. So we're not there yet on that part of the story.
Very cool, though. And you're opening up a whole nother line of interest and questioning with those kelp-based alginates. But I'm going to pause for a second before we dive back in there, just because it feels like this chemistry, the importance of being able to turn on and turn off antimicrobials to design something that's both efficacious but also safe, really ties into Billy's work. So I wondered, Billy, if you can take a few minutes here and tell us more about the work that you've done around creating safer preservatives, and how that's similar or complementary to the work that Heather was just talking about.
Yeah, glad to. That project actually came out of the Greener Solutions program. So as a student, when Marty was teaching the course, I was taking it in my 5th year of my PhD right before graduating. And it really, the teaching of it really resonated with me. I always really appreciated nature and wanted to use chemistry to have a positive impact there. The year that I was involved in the class, it's kind of like a miniature consulting class where you're working with stakeholders, working with companies that want to solve a green chemistry problem. And the problem that these companies had was they were all in the personal and home care space. So like home cleaning products, lotions, sunscreens, things like that. Those products need to be preserved as long as they contain a certain amount of water, which most of them do. And in order to preserve it and keep it from fouling, keep it from growing mold and bacteria that could potentially make people sick, a lot of preservatives are used that are pretty hazardous to humans in the environment. Some of them are isothiazolinones. It's a long, kind of confusing name, but it causes these really gnarly skin rashes and irritation to people that are sensitive. Like for people that are sensitized to these things, they can't even use paint because they'll start breaking out in hives as soon as they start inhaling it. So it's for most people, it's not a huge problem, but for some people, it's a huge problem. Other types of preservatives have other issues, like some of them contain ingredients that are carcinogenic or reproductive or developmentally toxic. Other ones are highly aquatic to aquatic life, fish and crustaceans, and can cause antibiotic resistance to clinically relevant antibiotics. So those are things like quats that are in your disinfectant sprays. So what we were supposed to do is develop alternatives that are safer, that could be broad spectrum antimicrobials without those hazardous issues. I started collaborating after the course, kept working with the Berkeley Green Chemistry Center, kept working with our stakeholder companies, the home and personal care companies, and began to do research at the USDA. And what we developed was a bio-based antimicrobial that is composed of 2 non-toxic subcomponents that have a long history of safe use in cosmetics and food. When they're in the presence of one another, they self-assemble with a reversible bond. This is by a hydrazone bond. And the cool thing about a hydrazone bond is that it's fairly stable, but also reversible. So once you have that active compound, it's extremely effective, very non-toxic to skin. We've done patch testing on that. And once it's diluted in a larger body of water, say an ocean or a lake, it breaks back apart to the subcomponents that are functionally different than the active compound, not likely to cause antibiotic resistance, and about up to 3,000 times less hazardous to aquatic life. And so, for example, if you had like a laundry detergent that had 1% of this active ingredient in it, you dump it into a swimming pool, once it reaches thermodynamic equilibrium, you've got over 90% dissociated. So we're developing that as a new strategy, not just for antimicrobials, but for other potentially hazardous chemical classes as well. Things like sunscreens, antioxidants, pigments, pesticides. And it's been a really interesting run. We're working with industry to try to get it out there. Some of the barriers are along its registration. For a lot of bioactives, you have to register them. That's expensive. It can be difficult to convince or persuade companies to do that. And so we're trying to build out the applications and increase the value of this chemistry in order to make it more attractive to partners in that way. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Excellent. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about what that, I think you're in a unique place at the USDA that works both with businesses and with more traditional researchers. What can you give any examples or tell us what it would take to get something like this from your lab bench out into the world? Like what would you need?
Well, ideally we need at least 1 or 2 partners that could help produce the chemical, register it, and then get it in final products. We're already working closely with a number of brands in the GC3 in order to kind of try to navigate this. But I think what would be very helpful for us is finding a partner that produces these types of chemicals that's familiar with the registration process and sees enough value in it to help move it forward with us. So that's going to be, multiple institutions that are involved. And so that would be the home run. But really, like any partners that were interested, I'm always offering to send samples out and let them try it out for themselves to see if it makes any sense.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you. So speaking of commercialization, I'd like to turn back to LoongYi and shift the conversation a little bit towards what do you see on the horizon? So we just heard from all 3 of you kind of about where things stand today in your labs and your research, all touching on water and antimicrobials in a certain sense. But Heather's comment about alginates got me thinking, and that is what do we need for the future of green chemistry? So what are the things that are on the horizon? You've started with glucaric acid here in this application of water treatment, but what do you see on the horizon? What are the next 3 or 4 targets that you can share with us that help us understand how Solugen's going to get from where they are today, say 150 people, to that next 100-acre facility and a few thousand people, so that you are the next Dow Chemical?
Sure. So I think it's ultimately we're still very young, right? So we're still trying to, we're building the go-to-market as we speak. But where we're at right now is we know we can make glucaric acid. We saw that it works really well for water treatment. So we've been focusing a lot on what other applications can we use it in? Like, is there a compelling benefit? So one that we saw that we're working on right now is concrete. So concrete, as you mentioned, is a huge topic from a CO2 emission standpoint, right? Like it's not up there with, it's a very big impact. And what we found is glucaric acid could be used to improve the strength of concrete and allow concrete to be multifunctional. So multifunctional meaning that we can improve the corrosion resistance of concrete. We can, if you increase the strength, you can potentially reduce the amount of cement that you need in your concrete. And that has a whole bunch of ancillary benefits, right? A, it's cheaper. B, it's less CO2 intensive, right? And then 3 is it helps, avoid some of the situations that we saw in Miami where, we had those condos fall over, and one of the root causes was inadequate corrosion protection, right? And steel reinforced concrete, right? So that's one application that we're working on that. We're really excited about both the volume potential, just because infrastructure is a big thing in the US, right? We're going to be building a lot of concrete, and we think that, there is a home for a new bio-based additive that, helps you reduce the amount of cement and reduce the CO2 footprint for every cubic yard of concrete. Another one that we're really focused on that we're super excited about is for agriculture. We know, there's a huge trend on, there's more people around the world, and we need, newer sustainable fertilizers to help, improve yields of, commodity crops like corn, as well as specialty crops like, tomatoes, for instance. And we saw that glucaric acid can be used to make like multifunctional specialty fertilizers. So a lot of the soils throughout the US, they actually have deficiencies of micronutrients. So like some areas don't have enough zinc, some areas don't have enough, X metal or Y metal. And we've seen that glucaric acid can replace some of the other chelates out there like EDTA that traditionally have done the job of, specialty fertilizers, but they have a whole host of biodegradable issues, right? Basically, EDTA is so good at binding to things that it persists in the environment for almost ever. And so we've been very focused, at least on the short term, on how can we find more drop-in replacement or applications where we can use glucaric acid as a molecule in formulations. But really the goal is, to make big impact. It's like, how do you take glucaric acid? How do we take our enzyme-based manufacturing platform and make new molecules that have a much bigger impact, and replace like base chemicals, So bioplastics is something we're very interested in or working towards, things like that. But for us, we've started with, applications where we know we can win on a price and an ESG standpoint. Let's get some market traction, let's get some volume going, and then ultimately that'll help us fund, the next wave of development in R&D.
Very cool, thank you. I know that replacements for EDTA is something that Billy has also looked at. I feel like there may be overlaps between the two of you after this call.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, EDTA, benzoate, they're synergistic, for antimicrobials, and a lot of people are looking for something different.
Exactly. And now that you touched on it, as well as Heather, I'd love to turn it back to you so that we can hear a little more about your bioplastic research, your alginate research, and kind of how it fits into this picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So our bioplastic research is in a pretty early stage, but one of the really big things that I see coming out of it, that's maybe a broader context lesson for us to think about in the green chemistry space. One is the idea of finding alternative alternative feedstocks that are not food crops. And I think that's a really, really big and important role there. And also, as we're thinking about new feedstocks, being able to think about working with them in fundamentally different ways. One of the big things that our work is doing at this stage is understanding what the various chemical properties at different degrees, kind of your primary, secondary, and tertiary structure, what those have to do with, how those correlate to the mechanical properties, the durability, all of those functionalities that we rely on traditional plastics for, and starting to be able to understand how we can design for and predict the sorts of properties that all of our conventional materials give us, but starting from a completely new starting point. And all of the tools of analytical and synthetic chemistry really give us groundwork to do that. We sometimes are looking at things as simple as the ratio between, if you have a chemistry lab at your disposal, as the ratio between two peaks on an NMR spectrum, and that being able to tell us a lot of information very quickly and very easily. And being able to say, when does that extrapolate out, and how can we make that reliable so that these materials become as straightforward to use and to scale up as the petroleum-based materials that we've been using for several lifetimes now.
Indeed, and the importance always, both to any sort of chemistry education and chemistry scaling, of structure function relationships. I think that is something that has often been missing when non-chemists just try to throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks in sustainability. So excited to see more coming out from that. I see one of our first questions coming in from the audience. So I think this is also a great reminder to our whole audience to please feel free to start writing your questions in the Q&A. And with that, I think, excellent. We'll head back on this topic of function because we have a question from the audience for Billy that is related to your take on phenoxyethanol. I know you just talked about some of the challenges of preservatives and why yours might be safer. I'm curious if you want to address or make any comments on phenoxyethanol or pass. It's okay either way.
I can comment on it. So one of the things when we started doing this research is we wanted to get a good sense of what solutions were out there. So we screened hundreds of different chemicals and pretty much all of the green alternatives that were currently commercial. Phenoxyethanol has a really good hazard profile. If you look at something like its green screen, if you go to ferrosproject.net, they have green screens of lots of thousands of different chemicals. It's relative to the ones that I mentioned before, the isothiazolinones, the formaldehyde releasers, the quats, much lower hazard profile, much lower aquatic toxicity, skin irritation, things like that. The downside is that you have to use a much higher level of phenoxyethanol. So you have to get sometimes upwards of 1.5 weight % of your formula to be phenoxyethanol. It sometimes doesn't have great compatibility with the formula as a whole. It can cause other compatibility, phase separation, possibly discoloration challenges there too. So I think it's great. It's good on its hazard profile. It's one of the better solutions that are out there, just strictly in terms of that. But you have to use, at least 10 to 15 times as much relative to a more traditional preservatives. So it's a trade-off there. There are a lot of, it's representative of, a hydrophobic alcohol class of preservatives, which is it's a larger category. Caprylyl glycol is another good one in that category. It might have a slightly better hazard profile, and it's also pretty effective in the ballpark of 0.75% and a little bit higher. Caprylyl hydroxamic acid, we also found was pretty good. It can potentially have some issues around discoloration as it tends to have a secondary benefit as a chelator. It could bind iron and discolor the formula. Those active levels were a bit lower. We found that you could get away in a lot of formulas at around 0.5 weight %. But I think, phenoxyethanol in terms of its hazard profile, it's pretty good. It's not renewably sourced to my understanding. I don't think anyone's making it from renewable sources. So that's one potential downside. But otherwise, it's a pretty good solution.
Yeah. And I think in the answer, you also hear the fact that, and this is something we hear from industry often, that you need multiple solutions for any of these functional challenges. There's never going to be a perfect solution for any given function. That's gonna work across products. And so I think we need more tools in the chemist and formulators toolbox. And one frustration that I have heard in the past about green chemistry is that people feel like we're taking options away from them. And I think the opposite is true, is we're providing more options, as you can see from all of the speakers today. And I want to turn it over back to LoongYi with this question from the audience, talking a little bit about the residence time of glucaric acid in water. And also it brings up this other point, which of breakdown mechanisms and products. So I want to take this opportunity to not only address the question from the audience, but also put it in the context of how do you think about the life cycle impacts of your production? Heather mentioned this earlier in some of her comments, thinking about source, use, and end of life. I'd be curious how you think of source, use, and end of life as you answer this question about breakdown mechanisms and products.
Yep, no, great question. And this is one of the technical ones that we deal with customers on a daily, regular basis. Because the first thing people say is, hey, it's cool that you have this new bio-based molecule called glucaric acid. It's sugar derived. If I put it into my cooling tower, does it cause me to use more biocide or some kind of chemical that needs to kill bacteria or bugs, right? That's like the first question that people say. And so what we've done is we've done testing that we've shown that the glucaric acid is stable within, sort of the typical residence time on the order of minutes to hours within the cooling tower. And so it's good, but then by the time it gets discharged into the outfall, it basically just biodegrades and decomposes back to CO2 and water, just sort of like what you expect out of sugar. But, I think, the exact timing wise, we're doing, that standardized OECD biodegradability tests that everybody does, to get, exactly is it, where does it span? But it's also application dependent, right? So what the decomposition time of one cooling tower may be slightly different than another. Marty, I think you brought up a really good point on life cycle analysis. That's something that we're, because we're a bio-based company, because there's this big focus on, life cycle emissions and things like that. That's something that we talk to customers on a daily basis about. And what's really interesting is we found that there's no standardized way to do that calculation, right? So life cycle analysis, there's sort of emissions from production, transportation, and then how it's used in the application, and then is it decomposed? Does the carbon get released back into the atmosphere, or is it one of those applications where it gets sequestered back into the ground, like concrete, for example? And so we spend a lot of time on this. We work with a third-party firm called Lifecycle Associates that helps us calculate these emissions, both on the production side, the manufacturing, transportation, and then also just capturing, they call it cradle to grave is what it's called. But then some people, they do cradle to production and they sort of stop there. But yeah, what we've done that analysis, and we've seen that, Solugen's chemoenzymatic process, so the enzyme plus the metal catalyst side, in general, we have a significantly lower footprint than even things like fermentation, and obviously, much lower CO2 footprint or manufacturing footprint than like, traditional petroleum-based processes. But
excellent. The next question that is actually one for the whole panel, and it's related to this question of definitions and kind of how we think about this. These are complex topics that really deserve time thinking about how do you get the right certification, how do you get the right kind of third-party validation. And one of the things that we've seen recently, both in the US and in Europe, is a desire to try to define sustainable chemistry. And the reason for doing so is so that there would be advantages on the financial side. You could get ESG credit. You could also get preferred financing from governments if you meet sustainable chemistry criteria. But then there also there's been talk of, should chemistry that goes through this route be treated differently from a regulatory standpoint? And so given the stakes, what's at stake, the definition of green chemistry or sustainable chemistry is becoming increasingly important. And so while this topic is going on, one, if you want to comment, it is a public comment period at the Federal Registrar, so you can put that link in there for anyone, either audience member or panelist. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear your thoughts, panelists, on how you would think about defining it, given the high stakes. Anyone, again, otherwise I'll point just like the old days. Go for it, Heather.
I was going to say, I'm not sure how you go about pointing on Zoom, but I mean, I think this is Kelly, and then David raises a very similar question after there about carbon production with these technologies. It is the $1 million question. I think that anytime that we're doing a substitution, we have to think about the scale of the benefits and the harms that we're answering on. I feel like my answer to this is going to be that I don't have an answer. And so in some sense, it's going to be a bit unsatisfying. So that's my spoiler alert. But that at different phases as we're developing these technologies, we need to be thinking at all of those scales. And so I think we see that all the way from when we think about the difference between acute toxicological harm, and many of the substitutions that have happened throughout history have moved away from, say, a solvent that is flammable and explosive to one that causes cancer. And is that better, or is that just different? And I think we're looking at the same question when we think on these larger scales, that, I mean, even considering kelp and that as a bio-based feedstock as a really great potential opportunity, what are the impacts going to be on the habitats in that region? Anything we do with water is both globally linked to climate change, but also very locally specific, and the ecosystems that we impact there. Working in the Pacific Northwest, we're often dealing with unique ecosystems that don't exist anywhere other than the coast of Vancouver Island. So what does it mean? What does it mean to impact those? And then I think the other big piece that comes into these questions is the environmental justice question of who benefits and who experiences harm from the choices we're making. And so if we are being able to substitute in a way that may not be better globally, but maybe more equitable in terms of impacts, is that a worthwhile trade-off? Is that a place where we need to be considering? And that might, in a lot of cases, mean that being in the United States and Canada, some of the negative impacts that we've been offshoring for the last however many years, we start bringing them back in-house and into our own backyards. And in doing that, that can be a part of driving the change to being more sustainable, having less climate impacts, because it's right there in front of us and we know about it.
Excellent point, Heather, and I'm glad you brought up the big challenge of who benefits and who pays the price for production. And I think that's certainly true whether we're looking at biological feedstocks or fossil feedstocks. Curious, Billy, LoongYi, if either of you have anything to add on kind of both this question of how do we define it, but also the question of unintended consequences of switching from bio-based or switching from fossil fuels to bio-based feedstock chemistry, since they're raised by both Kelly and David.
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting, good answer. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think, the picture is really complicated. Sometimes, green chemistry is all about making something that's less hazardous in one way or another. And so if you're able to measure a significant reduction in hazard without introducing other hazards in different categories, then that's a step in the right direction. And I think any sort of regulation should encourage that sort of thing, factoring things, not only multidimensional hazard analysis, but what volume is this chemical going to be made and what's the exposure risk for humans and, organisms in the environment. I think that the question around when we often look at something for, say, plastic alternatives, looking at biodegradable alternatives as being a solution, and I think there's a lot of good ideas there. You can start with ingredients that are inherently biodegradable. We know they're non-toxic in the environment. You can formulate an alternative to plastic. But what happens when it is biodegradable and it breaks down and it releases CO2, or if it goes to an anaerobic environment like a landfill and produces greenhouse gases? It isn't a perfect match for our infrastructure right now. So I feel like a change in infrastructure, maybe more industrial composting, could help solve both of those problems, but it's complicated. And the question around resource use, land and water use, as soon as you start making bio-based chemicals, that starts to enter the equation in a way that it didn't with petroleum-based chemicals. So it's complicated, and it depends on what comparison you're making. In some cases, it's very clear that there's an improvement, and in some cases, it's less clear. So I feel like the ones where the opportunities where a larger improvement is obvious should be encouraged.
Yeah, no, I thought, those answers were great. Ultimately, when you start bio-based feedstocks, you're always doing the food versus, feedstock kind of situation. So that's a key challenge. But, that's why we have to have a lot of technology providers, right, that are trying to find, for us, make new sugars from like cellulosics, for example, having, good pre-treatment versus using, let's say, corn sugar, for example. But yeah, no, it's complicated. There's no easy answer.
Yeah, sorry. And one other thing, making things from waste. If you can find ways to break down things like not only recyclables, but municipal solid waste, large waste from agricultural streams, and try to turn those into your feedstocks, that's, as long as you account for the transportation and the conversion in your life cycle analysis, that's a pretty consistent way of improving your LCA profile.
I think that it is an interesting question, what the shift from, if it's a good thing, and what the shift from fossil sources to bio-based sources are. I don't think it should be assumed that bio-based sources are always better, but there are also some clear differences. The most obvious one that I think about a lot is this the concentration of the feedstock. So the amount of carbon you get from growing things versus the amount of carbon you can get from pulling it out of the ground, it tends, or from waste for that matter, Billy, it tends to be less concentrated. And so our traditional model for chemical production has been to build larger and larger centralized plants, because shipping things is relatively easier and less impactful than the alternative. In a world where we're using more dispersed feedstocks, either from waste or from biomass, it seems like we need a different model for chemical production. So LoongYi, since you're at a business creating a next generation chemical plant, how do you think about right sizing not only this first plant, this 5-acre plant that you're at today, but plants in the future? Are you thinking about being close to feedstocks? Are you looking at other considerations? How do you think about, instead of just always building bigger, building a more distributed network of chemical production?
Yep, I mean, that's what we think about a lot. So ultimately, in the next facility, we're looking at, what is the cost of biomass sugar? For us, it's glucose, right? So like, what's the cost of glucose in that environment? Trying to understand part of the value of, I think, Solugen's technology is we're able to shrink the size of a traditional chemical plant and make chemicals cost effectively at a much smaller side. Because how I think about it, in the past, you had a really complicated facility that had complicated pipes, and that was your refinery essentially. And we've been able to sort of put that complexity into the enzyme. So if you visited our Houston facility, our unit operations are actually fairly simple compared to something that you would see at Dow Chemical. That allows us to shrink, the size or the footprint of our manufacturing facility, which allows it to make it more make chemicals cost effectively, like within 200 miles or 100 miles of end users, versus having to ship chemicals halfway across the country. I think what we realized was a lot of the cost of commodity chemicals is actually in transport, right? So that covers rail, that covers trucking, that covers distribution and packaging. And sometimes you actually might pay double for the material or more at the end of the day. And so, when we're considering where we're going to build the next facility, it's feedstock cost. Co-locating is a big driver. 2 is proximity to customers. And then 3 is there are there regulatory drivers, or is there a pain point in a local region that's forcing people to switch from their current suppliers, right? So I talked about phosphonates and how they're using water treatment. So one thing in the EU is they also have a lot of regulations where the European Union's causing companies or customers or end users to switch away from phosphorus-based chemistries because they're worried about algae blooms. We're starting to see similar things where no phosphorus water treatment chemicals are also used in Asia, specifically in China, because they're worried about that, right? So you can imagine there's a couple different considerations, and ultimately our next facility will be, where all those things sort of come together.
Awesome, thank you. And I think, Heather, I'd like to turn it back to you a little bit, because you have mentioned both the environmental justice perspective and some of the unique characteristics of the surrounding environment as considerations in your own work. And so I'd like to hear if you have anything to add about this notion of developing things in a sort of site-specific condition, or in a local, with the local community and environment in mind, and how does that look like if you're trying to bring a research question like that back to the lab? Like, how do we think about chemistry, which is such a basic and kind of universal thing, in the context of local?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marty, and a complicated question for sure. And I think it really brings home the idea that the chemistry we do, even though the fundamental principles that underlie it are universal, that the questions that we ask are fundamentally human questions. And so when we're asking how to do something the right way, that really shows up a lot in the right for who and in what context, and again, who benefits, who gets the opportunities. I think there is a lot of really interesting developments that are happening in areas that are adjacent to chemistry. For example, 3D printing, additive manufacturing, that are complementary and require these interesting and new materials, rapid prototyping through those technologies that allow, in some ways, the chemistry itself, and in some ways the effects of the chemistry to be localized and appropriate. And I mean, one of the things when you think about circularizing a material, the question has come up of, okay, is a bioplastic inherently going to be better? And that really is something that depends on the environment that it's being produced. And if you're producing a biodegradable plastic from a local biological source, and you're producing it in such a way that it can be appropriately recycled, maybe even upcycled, with facilities that are created in the environment that you're in, then your local economy can thrive from that. If you create a biodegradable plastic, but it has to be shipped off of the lovely island that you live on, possibly to another country in order for processing it to happen, then as LoongYi said, the costs around transportation can mean that this really great material isn't necessarily appropriate for where it is. But I think that ability, we think about it a lot in terms of the shapes of things we can build with 3D printing, but I think there is a lot of space to grow as we have these new types of materials and can get different properties out of them, to ask what is the right material that someone needs for something that they're trying to achieve.
Excellent. Thank you for taking that on, Heather. I'm looking at time and seeing that we're running up on the hour, and as with these things, how they often go is that now there's this great set of questions here from the audience that have just come in, and we've barely scratched the surface. But just to be respectful of everyone's time, I want to thank you all for your participation, and importantly for the work that you're doing to create safer and more sustainable chemistry for the world. I'm certainly leaving more energized than when I came into this this panel. So I want to thank you all. And I'm going to turn it back over to Megan to wrap us up.
Thank you, Marty. And I'm going to echo those thank you to the panelists as well as to the participants. I think having this engagement with the people who are here really, to me, it was the best way to spend Earth Day. It's having this conversation, hearing these perspectives, and hearing all of these great questions and the engagement. I just want to wrap up by also mentioning that there are a lot of ways to be involved in the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry as a student, as a campus member, but also as an industry partner or a community partner. So I'm sharing the website information here in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me directly as part of that partnership, but also if you're interested in follow up with any of the panelists or would like to, get an answer to a pressing question that you didn't quite get a chance to today. So thank you again for joining us. Happy Earth Day. Look forward to hearing from all of you.